All right. There are two things I wanted to talk about. Maybe a third one, which is that I'm working like 15 hours a day, which ends up being over 100 hours a week. That's pretty intense. And I think that's okay. I mean, I don't want to do that all the time, but doing it for a month or so is fine with me. Um, I'd rather do that than not accomplish something. Um, but no, two subjects. So the first subject is sort of about the police state. Now, I think we're in a police state now, and a lot of people would object to that, I know, because they would say, hey, it could get a lot worse. It's not like you're in a Nazi state. It's not like they're hauling away and assassinating journalists. Sure, some foreign journalists might get tear gas, but that's not near as bad as Nazi Germany. But to me, that's just a matter of degree. The degree is important, but there's no reason to wait for it to get really out of hand before you do something about it. And also, I think it's pretty out of hand right now. I think the proof of that is how much money we're spending on, you know, secret government, on espionage, wars, the CIA's secret, prisons, and that aren't necessarily so secret because they're getting leaked, but that operate in secret for years, and all the things that haven't been leaked that we can deduce or induce that are out there. I think these are features of a police state. And I think the ironic thing, what really is just peculiar to me, though I understand it a little bit, I think, is, we live objectively in probably the safest time ever. I grew up when, we had to worry about going to nuclear war with the Soviet Union, and things like that. When war between nations, bigger wars, far more common, were a reality. And and yet right now we're paranoid about terrorism, for example, and there's all kinds of ramifications on how we're spending our money. The bridges are falling down. Our natural disasters seem to be taking a bigger human toll than they used to, all at a time when we're just obsessed with finding some sort of war. It's almost like we've lost the war that kept some people's hearts at ease. They'd rather have this giant enemy and know we were spending giant amounts of money against it, and then when those giant enemies go away, we need to find minor enemies to justify the giant expenditures. And I'll tell you, when you realize, whether it's true or not, but when you realize for yourself the idea that war is not a necessary part of the human condition, it's an actual part of the human condition, but not a necessary part of the human condition, then a lot of the solutions that we need in the world, are not rocket science. They're known. Now, there's hopefully even more splendid solutions possible that we could find, but already, right now, we've had decades and decades, if not a centuries, of proof of certain ways to affect problems in the human condition. If you're concerned about things like, overpopulation, life expectancy, child mortality, malnutrition, self-reported quality of life. We know how to improve those things. There's more solutions to be had, but we already have solutions that we're not using, that we can improve upon. We're not improving upon them, and we're not even applying them. And often it's funny, it's for philosophical reasons, supposedly. It's like, I don't want to educate other people's children. It's just I shouldn't have to. And, by people that don't deny that as a better educated populace is better for society, but they just have some idea that yeah, but people should have to struggle to get it together themselves. People should be going into this debt slavery to get their education, and there doesn't have to be jobs for these people. Um, in reality, we know a lot of the solutions to solve the things that I'm talking about. We've applied enough of them to know that they work, and yet we're struggling because we just feel we have to spend so much money on war. And I'm not just blaming the United States. I mean, this is true in all countries. The United States is sort of a poster child for it because we spend so much more than anybody else, but everybody's spending too much on that. And it's just crazy, a lot of our foreign aid seems to have been entirely co-opted as military aid. We give a lot of money to countries that are close allies, or that we want to think of as our close allies, in order for them to turn around and buy them weapons from the private sector in America. And we pay to militarize the world and call that social aid, when that is not one of these known solutions to the world's problems. So as a matter of fact, war is pretty bad on the life expectancy statistics. So it just seems to me like we're at one of the safest times in human history, and the only thing that really justifies our attitude of paranoia. Well, you can't justify paranoia, but the grain of truth comes, just, it seems to me, from raising our standards about what we expect. The amount of safety we expect is still leading the safety we have. And I can't help but think that if people had more of an historical perspective, or just read The Prince by Machiavelli, they would understand where we're coming from, and how ancient some of the problems we still deal with now are, and yet how improved our understanding of those problems are. And realize that some way to keep improving our standards. You have to keep raising your standards if you want to achieve higher standards. But that sort of backfires on you when it turns into panic, and you start to impose a police state. When you start to think, yeah, everybody should have to carry their papers, and you have nothing to hide if you have nothing to hide. And so people you don't trust in the government that you're always bitching about can spy on you. Oh, well, that's necessary. It's just the irrationality of panic and fear at a time where as I say, I think if people had a more historical perspective, they would, they'd feel a little foolish about the level of paranoia. Doesn't mean they would stop trying to solve the remaining problems, but just they might be a little more rational. They might actually spend money solving them instead of just on things that make them feel safe for, psychologically disordered reasons. The other subject is this this theory that I'm going to call Phantasmagoricalism, and this is just a preface to it. I intend to pull up my whiteboard and try to be clear on my ideas on this, but just to give a preface to it, a little information. The idea is that we know consciousness can be broken down into parts, I feel. For example, split brain phenomena, or people that have, if you lose half of your brain as an adult, that can cause tremendous trouble. On the other hand, people that have, that have serious problems, like half of their brain didn't develop, they have human personalities. They behave consciously. They have less damage than you would suspect, and they have distinctly human personalities. And one, has no trouble imagining that they're conscious, that they have an internally conscious subjective experience, and affected by their condition, but not nearly as much as you would think. And then if you ratchet this down to the single-celled organism, I think you see in an objective sense, willful behavior. I mean, in the past, once I had shown, for example, a video of a paramecium being surrounded by an amoeba, you could see when the paramecium realize that they're trapped. Um, if you have paramecium in a glass tube, you can see it looking for a way out. You can see willful behavior. Now, this isn't human consciousness, but the consciousness of a mouse, you know, of any other mammal besides human is also not a human consciousness, but it's conscious. And if the word conscious, with the root being knowledge, is too much for you, then just think about this willful behavior, because how you don't have this privileged subjective perspective on any other consciousness out there, but you do grant that. And how do you really know other human beings are conscious is from willful behavior. They seem to walk uphill, whereas stones and water run downhill. They don't seem to react nearly as immediately to their environment in the same way, in proportion to the similarity of the systems that they are. And so, there is something to this willful behavior, and that's why somebody that is in a coma, lying in bed, does not look conscious. And you can wonder, are they really conscious in there? And sometimes people come out of comas and they say, yeah, I heard those conversations, I was conscious at that time. But more often they come out as if they came out of general anesthetic, and they report no consciousness during that period. Or for that matter, there is general anesthetic where brains can be put in states where they're not what we would call conscious. They still look human. Their body is still 99.999% doing what a human body does, and yet they're not conscious. And by saying that, we mean to speak about their internal experiences. But we can tell that to some rough, first order approximation by observing them, by observing a lack of willful behavior. And so, I think that this is a way, you have induction, deduction, and reduction, and this is a reductive way of saying that, it seems quite clear that you can create one whole human consciousness from two halves, two brains, two half brains, each of which could have a human consciousness. They can combine into one consciousness, and you can carry that downward into the neurons, which have willful behavior, and somehow they can combine in a network to create a higher level consciousness, a more complex consciousness. And this tells me that it is possible for conscious creatures to be in a network trading information, and not just any kind of network with any sort of information, but some sort of communication that could be studied, so that we could figure out which kinds of communication, which kinds of systems will on the whole become conscious. And from my point of view, we know that's true because that's what we are. We're colonies of eukaryotic single-celled life forms. We're networks of those, and we experience directly our own united sense of consciousness. They behave and have their own individual willful behavior, and then it carries on bigger as well. If two half brains can combine together into a single consciousness with an internal experience, then why couldn't 2,000 half brains do that? And I think they inductively could, because if two half brains can combine together into a bigger consciousness, then 2,000 brains could do it. Now, it does language, body language, spoken language, is that sufficient? Well, I don't know. We would have to know more about what kind of a network of conscious creatures can itself become conscious. But in principle, one assumes, if you would do some crazy scientific connection between brains, connect the brains or wirelessly connect brains, that there's no reason you couldn't combine multiple human brains into a single consciousness and expect that it has its own consciousness, just as we have our own consciousness that is composed of, but in some sense subjectively separate from the consciousness of its parts, right? We don't feel like we're two half-brains communicating. We feel like one consciousness, but we know from reduction that it's two half-brains doing that. And because of, my basing my beliefs on willful behavior, we also know that the billions and trillions of living neurons can combine together and create a consciousness and compose themselves into a consciousness. And furthermore, I think we have empirical information that the way mobs and groups of people behave, that there's a sort of consciousness there. And to me, I think the quality of the connection will reflect itself in the reflex time, the sort of the internal timing of the creature so combined, right? That but if we have poor communication, that'll slow down the transfer of information, so that information that the two halves of the brain can communicate in a split second, maybe it takes a year. And so you would see the behavior on this grander scale being slower, having a different mental clock speed than we have. And again, that's no different than the clock speed of a fly being, at least its visual reflex time being much faster than that of a human, because it has a tiny little brain and it can actually communicate inside its little internal system very quickly, and that gives it a high frame rate for its mental processes, even though it doesn't have a very seem to have a very complex conceptual framework to work with. Its consciousness does happen at this higher rate. Having said that, I think that you could see that the behavior of individuals is, as having conscious personality, is much more sophisticated than that of groups of people. The mass psychology tends to be way more primitive than what you could get from an individual, at least in my experience, my tastes and ways of judging. So phantasmagoricalism is going to be about this composition and decomposition of consciousness. And what makes it phantasmagorical is that I'm actually talking about these things having an internal mental state, that the paramecium that behaves willfully as though it has been, knows that it's been trapped, with panic, with an urgency to its search to escape, more urgent than the paramecium stuck in a glass tube, that there's an internal state to that. So the idea is that that if you could plug human brains together with a sufficiently sophisticated communication, at some point when that sophistication becomes as good, at the very latest, when it becomes as good as the corpus callosum, that it would actually have its own internal sense of self, right? It would have its own subjective appearance of unity, which we know is an illusion in some sense, but is also a real phenomenon. The illusion does happen. So yeah, that and let's just try to spend more money on infrastructure and less on war. I think that might just be a good idea. In fact, I know it would be.